Welcome everyone, and thank you to those joining us live and to those listening in afterwards. I'd also like to warmly welcome our guest speaker today, whom I will shortly introduce. I'm Nikolina Biskic, and currently I work as a Regulatory Affairs Manager in Switzerland. I will be the chair of the webinar. We are pleased to be delivering this webinar today on the topic of advancing towards harmonized global scientific and technical standards for generic drugs. Some of the learning objectives are how the FDA works with various global regulatory agencies and what is the function of FDA's generic drug cluster and its parallel scientific advice. Please note that this event is live streamed on PIP's YouTube channel, and it will also be recorded, and the recording will be available at events.pip.org website. To all those listening, please feel free to send your questions through the Q&A box, and our speaker will be answering those questions at the end of the webinar. I'm now pleased to be introducing our speaker, Dr. Sarah Ibrahim. She's the Associate Director for Generic Drug Global Affairs in the Office of Generic Drugs, Center of Drug Evaluation and Research at the FDA. And Sarah, the floor is yours. Please start.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much, everyone. And thank you for the kind introduction. As my dear colleague had mentioned, I'm Sarah Ibrahim. I'm the Associate Director for Stakeholder and Global Engagement in the Office of Generic Drugs, Center for Drug Evaluation and Research in the United States Food and Drug Administration. And really what the stakeholder encompasses is all of the international engagements which I lead, manage, and supervise, in addition to all of the outreach efforts. That includes patient advocacy groups, industry as well. So it is a very broad title, which is one of the reasons why I'm here, is to convey to you what some of the advancements are towards harmonized global scientific and technical standards for generic drugs. And in today's presentation, you will get to know more about the OGD Global Affairs Program, understand some of the highlights for our 3 global initiatives and efforts, focusing more on the generic drug cluster as well as the parallel scientific advice, and some take-home messages, particularly targeting industry that is more interested in submitting applications to both the FDA as well as the EMA in one of our very new programs available to you right now. So let's talk a little bit about why it's very important to have this discussion on a global scale for generic drugs. So in 2022, the worldwide market for generic drugs achieved a value of about $343.6 billion. Projections do indicate that this market will reach around $460 billion by 2028. Now, there's a compound annual growth rate, or a CAGR, of about 5% during the period from 2022 to 2028. So why is there a massive growth in this market? Well, it's largely driven by an aging population, as well as an increase in chronic diseases. In an effort to really manage healthcare costs, governments in developed nations are actively promoting the use of generic drugs. Now, these medications provide the same therapeutic benefits as their brand counterparts, but at a much reduced cost. Meanwhile, in developing countries, generic drugs offer that potential solution to the challenges of affordability as well as accessibility in the healthcare sector. So by providing these cost-effective alternatives to brand name medications, generic drugs can help to overcome some of these financial barriers, but more importantly, improve that access to essential treatments. So the 2022 U.S. Generic and Biosimilar Medicine Savings Report underscores the significant role that generic drugs play in the American healthcare system. There is a staggering 91% of prescriptions in the United States are actually fulfilled by generic drugs, despite the fact that they constitute over 90% of the prescriptions dispensed, these prescriptions constitute a mere 18.2% of the nation's expenditure on prescription drugs. So brand name products, they account for the majority of the pharmaceutical spending. The generics and biosimilar industries do play a crucial role in reducing the cost for consumers and patients. The report also indicates the annual savings from generics and biosimilars surpassed $338 billion, marking an increase of over $23 billion from 2019 alone. Now, these savings show a consistent increase or rise by about 7 to 10% each year. To give it to you in a better perspective, over the past decade alone, the availability of affordable generic drugs as well as biosimilars resulted in almost $2.4 trillion in savings for the healthcare system in the United States. Now, it demonstrates the substantial economic impact of these cost-effective alternatives to brand name medications. We know that generic drugs play a pivotal role in healthcare by providing patients with accessible treatment options. They're the cornerstone of patient access to essential medications. Now, particularly that generics ensure that healthcare remains within the reach for all segments of the population. Generic drugs are integral to reinforcing the drug supply chain, the availability of which can really help prevent drug shortages by providing those alternative sources of critical medications, contributing to the stability as well as the resilience of the pharmaceutical supply chain. All right, so in the past, the United States was the primary source of medication production. However, over time, and you can see on the nice graph here, that the manufacturing of drugs, particularly active pharmaceutical ingredients or APIs, has shifted more overseas. Now, the cost benefits offered by countries outside the United States, particularly lower labor costs, truly cannot be matched by traditional pharmaceutical manufacturing technology in the US. So just to illustrate how global the generic drug supply chain has become, we analyzed the location of API manufacturers for marketed abbreviated new drug applications or ANDAs with active and pending manufacturers. And you can see that from 2012 onward, there has been a steady increase in the percentage of ANDAs where an API manufacturer is based globally, and you can actually see that increase in India particularly. Conversely, the percentage of ANDAs where an API manufacturer is located in the United States has been on a decline since 2011, with only very few exceptions. So despite this global shift in drug manufacturing, the United States does continue to hold the largest portion of abbreviated new drug applications finished drug formulation manufacturers for these marketed ANDAs. However, there has been a consistent increase since 2012 in the percentage of ANDAs where a finished drug formulation manufacturer, again, is based in India. On the other hand, the share of ANDAs where a finished drug formulation manufacturer is located in the United States, very similar to the API, has also been decreasing since 2011. Well, given the global and complex nature of our generic drug supply chain, the FDA's international presence and engagement play a crucial role in securing our supply chain. The FDA's regulatory system ensures the quality and safety of drugs produced globally, even before these products hit the United States market. So the FDA does stand by the rigorous standards and regulatory inspections that ensure the safety and quality of all generic drugs, affirming that they're just as safe and effective as their brand counterparts. So the Generic Drug Global Affairs Program is a critical initiative that aims to strengthen the FDA's global collaborations. In fact, all of the centers within the US FDA do have an international program. The Office of Generic Drugs is the only office underneath these centers that has a standalone global affairs program, which I lead. So effective communication with our stakeholders is a cornerstone for this program. And we maintain open lines of communication that ensures all of the regulatory parties are informed about regulatory requirements, changes in policies, as well as any emerging trends and challenges. The program in particular also focuses on identifying opportunities for early regulatory alignments. Now, what this really involves is working very closely with international regulatory agencies to discuss standards and procedures for generic drug approval that is even under development. Now, that alignment really paves the path for harmonization that could expedite that approval process. It can reduce the duplication of efforts of all our agencies and, of course, industry, and ensure consistent quality of generic drugs across these different markets. We do believe in proactive engagement with regulatory counterparts. It's another key aspect of the Generic Drug Global Affairs Program. The FDA does actively collaborate with other regulatory agencies worldwide to share knowledge, exchange best practices, and also coordinate these efforts. So my program, the Global Affairs Program, has a number of engagements and initiatives focused on that international dialogue that promotes consistency, that will bring efficiency in the harmonization process. Remember, at the end of the day, harmonization for generic drug development is a global target and aim. So we do strategically take a more collective approach to establish more effective, consistent channels of information sharing and communication. In our first year, in the first year that I've led this program, we established the generic drug cluster. It is a critical initiative aimed at fostering global partnerships with leading regulatory agencies worldwide. This initiative is designed to address global challenges as well as opportunities in the generic drug industry. This Global Affairs Program focuses on establishing targeted outreach to support regulatory needs. And what that really means is that we communicate effectively to global stakeholders with a more of a targeted location that allows us to reduce the regulatory burden on the Office of Generic Drugs. In addition to that targeted outreach, the program also emphasizes on regulatory strengthening and capacity building of other regulatory systems. Now, that involves providing technical assistance to regulatory agencies worldwide, and the aim of enhancing their ability to oversee the safety, efficacy, and quality of generic drugs. So think about it from this perspective. The moment you do have harmonization, you need the regulatory systems within these countries that will enforce these harmonized guidelines and guidances and requirements to have the strength in order to be able to do that function. So harmonization of regulations, particularly for generic drugs, plays a crucial role in the global supply chain. It helps eliminate redundancies and efficiencies. By aligning regulations and standards across different countries, we can ensure that generic drugs are manufactured to consistent quality and safety standards. This not only protects patients from substandard or counterfeit drugs, but it also reduces the time and cost associated with bringing these new generic drugs to market. We increase patient access to affordable medications, which, as I mentioned in the early slides, it is the target for both developed as well as developing nations. Now, harmonized regulations enhance transparency and, really important, the traceability in the supply chain of generic drugs. Now, we understand that improvement does help in monitoring as well as reporting adverse events related to these generic drugs. It allows for early identification of potential safety concerns and the implementation of appropriate measures to safeguard patients. To put it into perspective, any adverse event anywhere on the globe is reported to the United States Food and Drug Administration through the many routes of information sharing, and there is, or should be, a more of a collective approach amongst all of the regulatory agencies. The intricacy of global harmonization is often attributed to the variety of legal systems, cultural and political values, and the economic structures that exist across different countries and regions. So to achieve alignment in regulations and policies often necessitates substantial efforts to reconcile these differences and balance all of these different various interests. The formal ICH procedure is a structured process and really consists of 5 steps. Now, they range from consensus building, which involves regulatory consultation, discussions, and finalization, and then the committee adoption, and then the regulatory implementation. Well, being a leader or a supervisor for that ICH involvements and engagements, I can tell you that it's a very extensive process. The true problem is that this journey towards global harmonization commences once regulations have already been established. And this rigorous process involves first assessing those regulatory differences, then conducting the scientific as well as the technical negotiations, and bridging the gap between already existing regulatory requirements and expectations. So the Office of Generic Drugs Global Affairs acknowledges that prospective harmonization efforts, particularly for complex generics, really can strategically bridge our regulations while they're being established. So global harmonization is a multifaceted and ongoing process that really requires cooperation amongst our various stakeholders. And the generic drug cluster, which I established in my first year in this role, serves as a unique platform for maintaining that continuous dialogue by fostering a shared vision and promoting discussions as regulations are being established rather than after they've already been established and implemented. So as I mentioned, in the inaugural year, the Global Affairs Program launched 2 very significant initiatives, the generic drug cluster, as well as the parallel scientific advice. And I really would like to use this opportunity to not only update you on these programs, but also share some insights that we've achieved or gained from both of these initiatives. So we know that globalization profoundly changed the pharmaceutical sector, creating unique regulatory challenges that require successful collaboration in a continuous dialogue. Now, regulators agree in principle of the importance of global harmonization of pharmaceutical regulations, aligning these divergent regulations that create hurdles that can really be mitigated by leveraging the ongoing dialogue and collaboration. And harmonization could also take the form of a very slow convergence, with regulatory bodies gradually aligning their standards and requirements. We have a vision of that regulatory capacity building of these agencies that will be responsible for implementing those harmonized regulations. And achieving harmonization of pharmaceutical regulations requires a collaborative effort among the stakeholders, convergence of best practices, having that regulatory capacity building to be more strategic, and effective implementation. And we can't stop there. We need to continue monitoring and evaluating those efforts. So to address the complexities involved in the development of generic products requires a collaborative approach amongst industry stakeholders, academic institutions, and regulatory authorities. The creation of a robust regulatory framework that does facilitate market access while ensuring patient safety is contingent upon that dedicated research and investment. And such advancements in research could potentially enable generic product applicants to rely more on alternative methods. And it is really important to be able to rely on those alternative methods, particularly to minimize any unnecessary exposure of human subjects. Now, this can be achieved through extensive exchange of scientific information, streamlining regulatory requirements, and clarifying any divergent regulations with our regulatory partners globally. Now, we also provide developers and manufacturers with the necessary channels so they can expedite their product development and enhance patient access to essential medications. Now, as an agency, we do place great value on that global collaboration. And we acknowledge that for certain products, such as complex generics that undergo a more intricate development process, access to multiple markets can incentivize companies to proceed with that development program. So one of the key benefits of the generic drug cluster that has been identified is its role in facilitating a global response. And we do actively monitor and analyze any emerging trends and developments on the global stage that could potentially impact our regulatory agency and its policies. And what that really allows us to do is review existing or new policies to address any gaps, challenges, possible opportunities, and risks posed by these global changes. We do collectively discuss and assess the impacts and implications of these global changes on our agency and its policies. The process can involve scenario analysis and risk assessment to ensure that we are collectively prepared for various outcomes, ensuring that there is no disruption to medication access to all our patients. Now, of course, we also evaluate and report on the performance and outcomes of our policies in relation to the goals and objectives of our regulatory agencies, as well as the global changes and policies. This ongoing evaluation ensures that our strategies remain effective and responsive to the evolving global landscape. Now, with a globalized generic drug supply chain, global events, international commitments, and any policies that arise have repercussions on the drug supply chain, and it can differ based on the nature, intensity, duration, and extent of the event or change. However, potential impacts could include drug shortages affecting the availability or accessibility of drugs for patients who require them. Quality and safety efficacy issues could potentially lead to adverse events and recalls that will inevitably also lead to shortage. Compliance challenges arise because adhering to the regulatory requirements or standards of different countries or regions involved in that drug supply chain. So global changes and policies do have a significant impact and on the regulations of generic drugs, and it affects aspects such as innovation and development of generic drugs as well. So that responsive changes in regulatory policies can either encourage or hinder innovation and impacting the development process due to these divergent regulatory responses from our jurisdictions affect access to generics globally. So as I mentioned, the FDA has established that multi-country forum known as the Generic Drug Cluster to foster a shared understanding of generic drug regulatory requirements among member agencies and to promote scientific alignment. The cluster consists of 7 regulatory agencies, and it serves as a platform for the world's leading regulatory agencies to facilitate harmonization through early communication and collaboration related to generic drug development in particular. The cluster does aim to establish proactive, prospective alignment on the specific proposed generic drug product reviews or broader drug class issues through that open communication. The cluster meetings to date have been instrumental in comparing and evaluating regulatory approaches, assessing similarities, as well as identifying differences, and that regular discussion on current review challenges have led to the resolution of several regulatory obstacles to approvability. Discussions also extend to regulations and guidances under development, with regular updates shared on various topics. Some of these topics include narrow therapeutic index drugs or critical dose drugs. One of the significant outcomes of these discussions has been progress made in model integrated bioequivalence for long-acting injectable products. In fact, you will be hearing more very soon. Agencies have also committed to sharing data integrity concerns at very early stages, allowing for more of a collective awareness of the ongoing investigations within our respective agencies. Another crucial aspect of the generic drug cluster is its role in anticipating and collectively discussing approaches and challenges due to these emerging global regulatory challenges. Now, it could be attributed to global and environmental policy changes that we know may impact the supply chain, promoting the identification and coordination of a multilateral response to global emerging issues. So I wanted to share with you some of the topics that we've been able to tackle in the generic drug cluster. It is a very unique forum because it is underpinned by the confidentiality commitments between our agencies that promote the leveraging of these collective resources amongst regulatory agencies. It includes sharing knowledge and expertise, and the cluster, of course, enables our agencies to transition from being data-rich to fostering that shared knowledge that enhances our individual capabilities in depth and breadth. Now, the cluster typically hosts quarterly meetings, and there has been a significant need for more frequent communications, leading to an increase in the ad hoc meetings that we've been hosting in the past years. So during these meetings, there are some recurring discussions, and they're held really to just compare the regulatory approaches, again, assess similarities and identify differences. And I already mentioned one of the discussions was the narrow therapeutic index drugs, but also recommendations for alcohol dose dumping studies and ongoing discussions on topical products. I mentioned the advancements made in model integrated bioequivalence and long-acting injectables. Now, another really unique perspective is the cluster participants share data on human testing of certain drugs where there's a discrepancy in the testing population, for example, patient versus healthy volunteers. And I want you to think of it from the perspective of industry, that when they're investing in these complex products, accessing multiple markets really does allow them to recruit that investment that they've made in their development program. And we have a challenge that if you have different patient population, or the population testing is variant amongst our jurisdictions, it adds another level of hindrance to industry. Now, that assessment of that combined data, it can support our converging recommended testing populations. So for example, if no statistically significant difference is found between patient and healthy volunteer populations, it opens up the possibility for a wider pool of testing participants for these classes of drugs. And I mentioned, and truly critical to really take this message in, is the sharing of concerns about data integrity related to bioequivalence and pharmacokinetic data in these generic drug applications. Please understand that the integrity and quality of the data that establishes bioequivalence is fundamental for approving a generic drug product by proving that it is equivalent to the brand name drug. Sharing these data integrity concerns, findings within a structured and secure information sharing environment helps our agencies deploy protective measures to ensure an effective response to any threats that do arise. For instance, an agency can alert members of potential data integrity concerns and provide clear messaging from the regulator's collective voice as issues become apparent rather than just prior to taking regulatory action as was in the past. We did publish our one-year cluster accomplishments and contributions, and over the past year, marking the second year of the cluster, we've made significant accomplishments and contributions, and we continue to build on those efforts. And giving you some perspective on some of the topics that have been tackled specifically and really honing in on those topics is evaluating the sameness of active pharmaceutical ingredients, particularly focusing on peptide functionality activities using in vitro and in vivo assays, ensuring that the APIs in generic drugs are equivalent to those in brand name counterparts. Complex products that currently have no generic competition, and critical issue that impacts the availability, access, and affordability of these drugs for patients, of course. We've been working to understand other generic cluster member agencies' approval standards and the rationales behind them, as well as their review experiences, and include specific discussions on partial AUC recommendations for certain products. And member agencies shared their perspective and experiences on the use of foreign comparator. We've also discussed the challenges with assessing data from alcohol dose dumping studies, as well as safety data, where we compared and investigated safety data of bioequivalent studies conducted in healthy subjects versus patient population, especially for complex products, as I mentioned, where the bioequivalence subject variation exists among agencies. We conducted investigations on PK profiles of parenteral nanotechnology products, amongst a number of other recurring topics. Our GDUFA, or Generic Drug User Fee Amendment and Science Research Priority Initiatives for 2023 were also impacted by the discussions in the cluster, and they aim to proactively address future challenges and be more scientifically adaptive to emergent challenges, inevitably facilitating access to patients. Now, consistent with FDA's commitment reflected in the GDUFA reauthorization performance goals and program enhancements, FDA held a public workshop on May 9th and 10th of 2022 to obtain input on the GDUFA science and research priorities. These 8 areas encompass scientific challenges that generic drug industry and FDA's generic drug program identify as being significant over the next 5 years. And they also represent opportunities for scientific advancements so that, again, we accelerate access to complex generic drug products and make the development of generic drugs more efficient and globally harmonized. Our generic drug science and research initiatives public workshop, and I highlight and stress public, so you are able to attend these workshops. It witnessed an extensive dialogue, in particular focused on the regulatory body's shift towards more standardized approaches and harmonization of certain aspects of regulatory review and requirements. We understand that the global nature of the generic drug industry triggers discussions of research priorities particularly relevant to the global nature of the generic drug industry, including scientific issues and barriers to the alignment of international bioequivalence recommendations and study designs. We are, again, noting progress made in the discussion triggered a dialogue both in the cluster as well as the upcoming GDUFA Science and Research Priority Initiatives for 2023. The FY 2023 GDUFA Science and Research Priorities illustrate how we support the development of generic drugs more efficient and globally harmonized. And if you notice in section 6, it incorporates the GDUFA 3 priority to improve the efficiency of bioequivalence approaches for oral and parenteral generic products. This research area focuses on understanding on how ingredients in oral and parenteral drug products may modulate bioavailability and on improving biorelevant dissolution methods, as well as in silico models to support the expansion of biowaivers and to support global harmonization. Some examples of these specific initiatives relevant to the global harmonization include utilizing physiologically based PBPK modeling to identify risk factors for food effects and formulation-dependent drug interactions for orally administered products to support global harmonization of the most efficient bioequivalence approaches for these products. Developing evidence to support the feasibility of efficient bioequivalence methods for parenteral drug products that may contain compositional differences relative to the reference listed drug and to support global harmonization of the most efficient bioequivalence approaches for these products. So I'd like to shift gears. I've been talking about the generic drug cluster, and the generic drug cluster is truly a dialogue between regulatory agencies. So where does industry stand? So we know that the generic drug pharmaceutical industry, as well as regulatory agencies, they increasingly seek opportunities to proactively engage in the early stages of product development. And we therefore established, again, in the first year of the program, and it was launched in September 15th of 2021, we established the Parallel Scientific Advice Program for applicants of abbreviated new drug applications for FDA's complex generic drug products and marketing authorization applications for EMA's, or the European Medicines Agency, hybrid products. We established a mechanism that allows assessors from both EMA and FDA to simultaneously share their perspectives on scientific issues with applicants during the development of complex generic drug or hybrid products. Now, this approach was designed to enhance dialogue between the two agencies and the applicants from the very early stage of a complex generic drug product lifecycle. It aims to provide a deeper understanding on the basis for regulatory decisions, optimize product development, and avoid any unnecessary duplication of studies or diverse testing methodologies. So why? Why is the PSA important? As I mentioned, it does increase the dialogue between the two agencies. It optimizes the applicant's global product development program. So if industry is aiming to access both markets, this will allow you to discuss specific questions concurrently with both agencies. It will then provide you as an applicant with a deeper understanding of the basis for regulatory decisions from both agencies. Now, it will drive convergency to help applicants avoid any redundant replication of work, any unnecessary testing, replication, or unnecessary diverse testing methodologies, and of course, that larger population testing, which we're trying again to reduce subject exposure. So what does that really do? Well, when you do want to access both markets and having that early discussion, allowing us to converge our discussions. And I've already mentioned that in parallel, we have the generic drug cluster that will discuss any of these topics that we may not be aware of, may shorten the time to drug development and approval. And at the end of the day, our agencies want access to these medications for their population that they have committed to serving. So let's give you a little bit of a comparison. And what I'm trying to compare here is the parallel scientific advice, which, as I mentioned, is applicant-led, and you will submit those questions in the early development process to both EMA and FDA, in comparison to the product development meeting that is usually granted for non-complex generic drug products. For complex generic drug products, but also may be granted for non-complex. So what do? Well, eligible products are complex and hybrid products. Complex products from an FDA perspective and a hybrid product from EMA's perspective. Usually the first question we get, well, what if this product is not a hybrid product by definition? Typically, my answer is, if you are not certain, please ask. You can ask in many ways. You can submit the question through the PSA program, allowing both agencies to decide if this is an eligible, or you do have access to controlled correspondence. So you can communicate with FDA, seeking some guidance and answers on what route of meetings are suitable for your development program. For the product development meetings, this is typically for complex products, and as I mentioned, sometimes may be granted for some non-complex generic drug products. You should be requesting those meetings for PSA if you seek advice from both FDA and EMA on your global development program. You seek the advice for the product development meetings, or the PDEV meetings, where there's no PSG, or there's a new alternative bioequivalence method that you're proposing that is different from the current PSG recommendation. The way to really request a parallel scientific advice is to request, and I stress, to the 2 email boxes. You can either reach to the EMA directly, or of course, submit a pre-ANDA help at fda.hhs.gov. For a product development meeting, you will send the request through NextGen portal. So how do you know the decision? Well, you either are granted or denied the request. Typically for the PSA, 14 days is needed to determine if it is acceptable or if it is approved for you to submit your full package. And for the product development, again, a very similar outline, which is those 14 days. Once you submit your meeting request, you have been approved, you submit your meeting package. It takes 120 days roughly from receiving that full package. Now, we understand that there could be some variation between the meeting request being accepted and that full package submission may vary, versus for product development, it is 120 days from meeting being granted. So please follow up with a question if this seems to be slightly confusing, because one is dependent on you, the industry, to submit the full package, and then you can count your 120 days, versus one that will take 120 days from when we granted you that meeting. For the PSA, you have the FDA, EMA, as well as the applicant in that trilateral meeting, versus in the product development meeting, you have the FDA and the applicant. For the PSA, you do have a teleconference with a video option, so there can be a video conference meeting. Versus the product development, we are now back into in-person, face-to-face, but also the video conference is available. The meeting length does vary So for the parallel scientific advice, this is around 90 minutes. Of course, because you have 3 entities in that discussion and in that meeting versus the 60 minutes in the product development meeting. So we launched this pilot PSA in 2021, and we've learned a lot. Now, the number of applicants who did submit generic drug applications to the FDA and the centralized EMA process is very limited. So what we've been able to accomplish so far is that we've received 2 PSA meeting requests. Both have been granted, and both have gone through the entire PSA process. Upon those 2, or based on those 2 PSA meetings, we have conducted an assessment on how well the PSA program is going. And we really have observed that it can be an opportunity to expand the number of generic drug applications that do submit applications to both jurisdictions. So think of it as an opportunity to not only expand, but also expand your market, because you're now accessing two different markets or 2 different jurisdictions. Some applicants did express concern that the PSA program could possibly require additional testing beyond what's expected if the applicant was reaching towards the pre-ANDA program or a product development program versus the scientific advice from EMA. However, that's not been the experience, and I want to reaffirm that has not been the experience with the pilot applications submitted. It was a learning experience for both regulators as well as applicants, because it does allow us to understand the differences in the processes as well as the meeting expectation. And remember, at the end of the day, a dialogue will at least achieve some convergence on the science basis. Now, in general, and I want to come for industry, that the pilot was implemented as intended, and it does seem to demonstrate long-term potential. The immediate benefits are more visible to the regulator than the applicant, because all of the behind-the-scenes discussions have created a bridge amongst our scientific expectations through that scientific dialogue. And the recommendations were made based on the program's preliminary assessments. And what we've been able to achieve is provide you with some procedural clarifications, as well as the clarity of the timeline and expectations. And I hope that parallel comparison allows you to really see the differences in timeline. There's very minimal differences between the processes. And of course, my recommendation would be the best practices for those meeting package preparation and participation. FDA has communicated with EMA and implemented these key recommendations to further improve the process. All right, so here are my tips for you. If you are industry seeking parallel scientific advice, please know the process. When in doubt, ask the FDA or EMA. Consider being very aware of the jurisdiction differences. One thing you don't want to do is to come and ask a question where we already have scientific alignment. You want to make sure that you're assessing the differences that could be a hindrance to your development program, and therefore raise those issues with both agencies. When you're coming into that trilateral meeting, define the purpose. Make sure you review any correspondence prior to that meeting so that you do not rediscuss a topic that's already been resolved. And as always, with any application review meetings, work closely with your project manager that's been assigned to you along the way. So to give you some of the take-home messages, the FDA is committed to taking these steps to make sure that we enhance and streamline the development and approval of high-quality generic drugs. What we're doing are multifaceted. We're collaborating to share information through the generic drug cluster in what we call closed rooms with regulatory agencies. But we're also promoting harmonization of bioequivalent standards evident by the advancements in ICH M13A and the current work M13 be, and very soon these regulations will begin to be implemented due to the extensive efforts of the OGD Global Affairs Program. And we are trying to reduce redundancy by promoting that efficient drug development program through utilizing the parallel scientific advice. So what do I encourage applicants to do? Please participate in ICH harmonization efforts, because you are an equal contributor to the regulations that will then be harmonized to be implemented globally by those, or of course, by those agencies that have adapted ICH. And also in a challenging program, development program, where you seek multiple markets, the PSA program is your route for complex or hybrid generic drug products. So again, I want to make sure that I take the opportunity to address some of the feedback we received from industry. The timeline for the parallel scientific advice, they are similar to those for comparable processes across both the FDA and EMA. Most of the variability in these timelines depends on the applicants and the time frame between the initial inquiry and the submission of a mature briefing package by the applicant. And I hope you were able to determine that, yes, it is 120 days. However, it is 120 days from when an applicant submits a full package. And we are committed to sharing those timelines with you that provide predictability regarding on when you will be receiving advice from both agencies. So regulatory harmonization aligns these regulations and standards across different countries or regions to reduce trade barriers and create a more efficient and effective global supply chain for medications in general, and of course, including generic drugs. And this harmonization helps ensure that medicines are manufactured and distributed to consistent quality and safety standards, and it does benefit patients ultimately. Regulatory authorities must have the necessary competencies, capacity, resource, as well as the scientific knowledge to be able to deliver their harmonization mandate effectively. So that sound system is truly what we rely on. Regulatory authorities, again, must have the competency, capacity, resource, and scientific knowledge to be able to protect the public's health, safety, and welfare by regulating the activities of these individualized or individuals and organizations that pose a possible risk. So regulatory strengthening and building regulatory capacity improves the regulatory enforcement in the specific country or region. And the goal for that regulatory system strengthening is to improve the ability of these regulatory authorities to ensure safety, quality, and effectiveness of medications, including generic drugs. Now, what are we doing? Well, we are involved in a number of training and technical assistance to regulatory authorities, increasing regulatory inspections and monitoring of testing medications, and of course, implementing stronger enforcement measures to deter the production and distribution of counterfeit or substandard medications. Regulatory harmonization does tend to focus on the global supply chain that may possibly reduce trade barriers, while regulatory system strengthening tends to focus more on building that, again, regulatory capacity and improving enforcement. Both approaches complement each other with harmonization efforts so that you can have a more consistent and efficient global supply chain. And why do we do that? Because all our citizens need and should expect quality and safety of medications within each jurisdiction that they're in. Some of the other activities that my team has been very active in is regional outreach, and we've targeted many regions with a number of workshops that we've hosted consistently over the past years. And of course, we have another upcoming workshop, I believe, in India very soon. So please be on the lookout for all of these global engagements and workshops within your jurisdictions, because a lot of times they do contain regional specific topics and discussions. And with that, I would very much like to open the floor for questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sarah, for delivering this webinar.
Thank you.
As a reminder, the recording will be available on events.vip.org website, but right now, of course, we can take a look at the questions that participants left. Okay, I will just read them out. So the first question says, please elaborate more on the US FDA Orange Book, which lists generics in categories therapeutic and bioequivalent generics. How do pharmacists and doctors, how can pharmacists and doctors use this list to substitute quality assured generics from a market flooded with quality assumed generics?
Can we clarify if this is a question for pharmacy practice within the US? Or is this for a global stance?
Well, you can elaborate on a global level.
Sure. So, you know, approved drug products with a therapeutic equivalence evaluation is published in what is known as an Orange Book. And food for thought, it is called Orange Book because it was actually published in October, and October is the Halloween month, and therefore it got the name Orange Book. But what the official name is, it is called the Approved Drug Products with Therapeutic Equivalence. It lists approved medications based on safety and effectiveness by the FDA, and will list any related patents and exclusivities. So not only is this used for pharmacy practice to find the therapeutic equivalent or healthcare professionals, but it's also used by industry to be able to determine, you know, is there a generic alternative? Has the patents and exclusivities expired? Can we submit this program, our development program? So really, it depends on the jurisdiction. In the United States, there's a coding system in the Orange Book that will tell you if it is therapeutically equivalent. And sometimes you will see a D grade level where there's any concern and therefore it is no longer therapeutically equivalent and substitutable. But for every jurisdiction, there is a different law provided. Although we have been told that many jurisdictions rely on the Orange Book. So hopefully, you know, that kind of, if it helps you. But as I mentioned, it is used by industry for development, and it is used by healthcare professionals. In fact, substitution of a generic product is actually also state specific. So you have different pharmacy laws in the different states in the US that will entail, are you to dispense a prescription as is, or are you required to dispense a generic drug product?
Great, thank you very much for that answer. So the second question is this. So after development of a generic drug in USA, what is the whole process regarding the registration of generic drugs and the fees that are charged?
In the US?
Yes.
Well, so you pay the fees prior to your approval. So when you submit your application, there's a filing review. If it is complete, there's a fee assessment. You pay the fee. The fee is waived, and under certain circumstances, these fees are paid prior to approval. When you have a marketed product, there is a fee that is associated with the facilities you have, as long as this product remains on the market. And if you really want to get into the details of the fees, I recommend, if you do a very simple search on user fees and FDA, there's an extensive list of what these fees look like, depending also on the size of the applicant.
Great, thank you very much for that answer as well. So Those were all the questions that the participants left in the Q&A box. There are also some questions regarding the certificates, and yes, everybody will receive it via email after the webinar finishes. So once again, thank you, Sarah, very much for delivering this webinar, and thank you for everyone who joined or who will be listening to this afterwards by watching the recording on FIP's YouTube channel or on FIP's website. Yeah, that's all for today. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a great rest of the day. Bye.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your day.